A research station, drifting at the edge of map space, so far from anything alive that even the stars look lonely. Inside a corridor, white lights humming, the kind of silence that has weight. A man sits on the floor, back against the wall, jacket wrinkled, eyes tired. He looks 32. He has looked 32 for 3 decades. He avoids mirrors. He avoids people. He avoids anyone who might look at his face long enough to realize that something is very wrong. Then, an airlock alarm, a ship that wasn't expected, a woman standing in the doorway. Tall, composed, not human. She sees him, and her entire world collapses because she knows that face. Her mother described it to her, every detail, every scar, for 30 years. The face of a dead man, a man who saved a queen, a man the galaxy buried as a hero, a man who forgot to die. The station breathed, not like a living thing, more like a machine pretending to be one. A slow mechanical wheeze that rattled through the walls every 40 seconds. Calder had counted, because of course he had counted. 3 months alone on a research outpost in the dead belt of the Tethys corridor will do that to a man. Turn him into someone who counts the breaths of ventilation systems and talks to coffee mugs and names the maintenance drones. Drone number 4 was Gerald. Gerald had a wobble in his left rotor that made him drift slightly sideways whenever he turned corners. Calder found this endearing, which probably said more about his mental state than he wanted to examine. The corridor lights hummed, white, clean, faintly judgmental, as if they disapproved of how little he had accomplished since waking up. Which was fair. He had accomplished nothing. He had eaten a protein bar that tasted like cardboard wrapped in regret. He had stared at a research terminal for 20 minutes without reading a single word. He had adjusted the sleeve of his worn jacket 3 times because the cuff was fraying, and he kept forgetting to fix it. Thrilling stuff. He caught his reflection in the dark panel of a powered-down monitor and looked away. Fast. The way you pull your hand from a hot surface. Instinct, because that face in the glass was wrong. Not damaged, not scarred, just wrong. Too young, too smooth, too much like the face of a man who should have been dead 30 years ago. Calder was 63 years old. He looked 32, and that, right there, that was the problem that had eaten his entire life. He walked, not toward anything, just away from the reflection. The station was small enough that walking in circles was inevitable, but he did it anyway, past the medical bay he never used, past the observation deck where stars hung like diamonds someone had scattered and then forgotten to sweep up, past the airlock where nobody ever came. Nobody ever came. That was the point. He had chosen this posting specifically because it was the kind of place the universe forgot existed. A xenobiology cross-check station. Minor work. Paper shuffling dressed up as science. The kind of assignment that made ambitious people weep and made Calder feel something dangerously close to safe. Safe from questions. Safe from cameras. Safe from the slow, inevitable horror of someone looking at him too long and saying the words he dreaded most. You haven't aged. 3 words, simple, devastating. He had heard them 11 times in 30 years, 11 different faces, 11 different moments of confusion, turning to suspicion, turning to fear. Because humans fear what they cannot explain. And Calder, well, Calder was very hard to explain. So he ran, every time, new name, new station, new corner of the galaxy where nobody looked too closely. He had been a dock worker on Meridian 7, a field medic on the Carthage supply line, a teacher's assistant on a colony ship where the children called him Mr. C, and he taught them basic anatomy and tried not to think about how they would grow old, and he would not. He had been so many people. None of them were real. The real Calder died on Kiro Station 30 years ago. At least, that was what the records said. And who was he to argue with records? Records were official. Records had stamps. The colony ship had been the hardest. 3 years with those kids, teaching them the names of bones, the order of organs, the way blood moves through the body like a river system that never rests. They drew pictures of hearts for him, bright red, lopsided, with smiley faces inside the ventricles. He kept every single one. Then one of the teachers started looking at him funny, doing the math, checking his hire date against his face. He saw it happening the way you see weather approaching from a distance. Clouds forming, air changing, the question building behind her eyes. He left before she asked it, packed a bag at 2 a.m., took a shuttle to nowhere. Didn't say goodbye to the kids because saying goodbye would have required a reason. And the reason was too big to fit inside any words a child would understand. That was 8 years ago, or 9. Time blurred when you stopped measuring it by aging and started measuring it by loss. He sat down on the floor of the corridor. Just sat. Back against the wall. Legs stretched out. Gerald the drone drifted past, wobbled, bumped gently into his boot, kept going. Thanks, Gerald, Calder said. Very supportive. He pulled out a small data chip from his jacket pocket, worn smooth from handling. On it, a single photograph. Harlan, grinning at the camera with that ridiculous confidence of his. Taken 2 weeks before Kiro, 2 weeks before everything. Calder looked at it the way you look at a photograph of someone you failed, with tenderness and guilt braided so tightly together you can't tell which one hurts more. He put it back, leaned his head against the wall. The station breathed, and Calder waited for nothing, the way he always did. The airlock alarm went off at 14:07 station time. Calder was in the middle of not reading a research paper about microbial adaptations in low-gravity soil. He had been not reading it for 40 minutes, very committed to not reading it. So when the alarm shrieked through the corridor like a mechanical bird having a crisis, he actually jumped. Not a dignified jump. The kind where your knees do something embarrassing and your elbow hits a console. Docking request, unscheduled. He stared at the alert, blinked, read it again. Unscheduled docking requests happened on this station approximately never. The last visitor had been a supply drone 4 months ago. Before that, nothing. Before that, more nothing. His fingers moved over the console, pulling up the approach signature. Small vessel, personal transport class. Registered to a system he didn't recognize. The identifier codes were in a script that wasn't human. Alien vessel. His stomach did something unpleasant. Not because he was afraid of aliens. He had worked with dozens of species, spent years on stations where humans were the minority. He liked aliens. Generally speaking, they asked fewer personal questions than humans, lower risk. But an unscheduled alien vessel docking at a forgotten research station in the middle of nowhere was not normal. Normal didn't exist out here. But this was aggressively not normal. He authorized the dock. Because what else was he going to do? Say no to the first living being he had seen in 3 months. His social life was conversations with a broken drone. He was not in a position to be selective. The airlock cycled. Pressure equalized. The heavy doors slid open with a hiss that sounded almost polite. And there she was, standing just beyond the threshold. Tall, composed, dressed in layered fabrics that shifted color when the light caught them. Deep blues bleeding into silver. The kind of clothing common to the outer systems. Elegant without trying. Or trying so hard it looked effortless. Hard to tell. Her posture was precise. Shoulders set, spine straight. The kind of stillness that humans usually abandon after 30. Because human bodies get tired of pretending and start slouching toward honesty. But hers was held, controlled, intentional. Then he noticed the ears, longer than human, tapered, sweeping back through dark hair pulled into a formal braid. And her skin carried a faint undertone, not green exactly, more like the memory of green, the way a forest looks in the last light before dusk. Alien, but only just enough to matter. She was looking at a handheld device, reading data. Her brow slightly furrowed. She hadn't looked up yet, hadn't noticed him standing 20 feet away in a wrinkled research jacket with protein bar crumbs on his sleeve. Calder cleared his throat. She looked up, and the world stopped. Not metaphorically, not poetically, it stopped. He saw it happen, watched her face go through something he couldn't name. Recognition, confusion, disbelief. Then something worse, something that looked like grief crashing through a wall it had been hiding behind for a very long time. Her eyes locked onto his face, traveled to the scar near his chin. The small one. The stupid one he got when he was 24 and tripped over a medical cart during a night shift. A nothing scar, a footnote on his body, except she was staring at it like it was proof of something impossible. Her hands began to shake. "No," she whispered. Calder stood very still. The way you stand when you realize a situation has become larger than you, and the best strategy is to be as small as possible. "No," she said again, louder, her voice cracking at the edges. "No, no, no." And then she started crying. Not quietly, not gracefully, not the kind of elegant tears that happen in films where the lighting is soft and the music swells. This was raw, breath-stealing, the kind of sudden grief that makes even the air around it feel guilty. She pressed both hands to her mouth, shoulders shaking, eyes wide and red and locked on him as if looking away would make him disappear. Calder had no protocol for this. There was no section in any handbook anywhere titled, "What to do when a stranger with long ears looks at you like you've personally murdered the concept of time." "I'm sorry," he said, because apologizing for existing had served him reasonably well in academic settings. And at this point it was reflex. She took a step forward, then another, as if pulled by a gravity that hadn't gotten the memo about personal space. "You don't get to be sorry." Her voice came out raw, broken in places. "You're supposed to be dead." Calder exhaled slowly. "Right." He paused. "Okay, I feel like that's something people usually ease into." She let out a sound, half laugh, half sob. The kind of noise that happens when your body cannot decide which emergency to respond to first. "My mother described you," she said. "Exactly like this. Exactly. The same eyes, the same ridiculous scar near your chin." Her breath hitched. "She said you smiled like you were embarrassed to exist." Calder reached up and touched the scar, self-conscious now, suddenly aware of every molecule of his own face. "In my defense," he said, "I am embarrassed to exist, most days." That earned him a hysterical half-laugh through tears, which did absolutely nothing to make the situation less alarming. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, annoyed at herself, at the tears, at the impossibility of him. And Calder stood there, useless, the way men are useless when confronted with grief they didn't cause but can't fix. He wanted to say something helpful, something wise, something that would bridge the gap between a dead man in a record and a living one in a wrinkled jacket. Nothing came, because what do you say? When someone is crying at you, not because of something you did, but because of something you are, something you failed to stop being. He settled for standing very still and trying to look less like a ghost. She straightened, pulled herself together with visible effort, the way someone reassembles dignity after it has been shattered in public. It took her about 30 seconds, which impressed him. He had seen trained diplomats take longer. "Princess Lyrian," she said, "of House Sithara." A beat. "And you are Calder, human doctor, the man who saved my mother's life during the plague outbreak on Kiro Station." Calder's brain did several things at once, none of them useful. Princess, plague, Kiro Station, mother. Oh, oh no. "I worked on a lot of stations," he said carefully, "and I saved very few important people, statistically speaking." "You died," she said, flat, like a fact, like a door closing. 30 years ago, the records say you refused evacuation, continued treating patients, were lost when the quarantine failed." "Yes, well, He shifted his weight. Records also say I'm bad at paperwork. So maybe they just assumed. Lyrian stared at him, eyes red, but sharp now. The grief was still there, but something else was rising behind it. Something harder, more focused. You haven't aged. There it was, the 12th time. 3 words, and they landed heavier than all the 11 times before, because this time, the person saying them wasn't suspicious, wasn't afraid. She was hurt. Personally, deeply. He had been dead to her mother, to an entire civilization, for 30 years. And here he stood, in a wrinkled jacket, with crumbs on his sleeve, looking exactly the same. I moisturize, Calder said, weakly, aggressively. She didn't laugh this time. My mother is old by our standards, Lyrian said. She has ruled for 3 decades believing the man who saved her gave his life doing it. She searched for you until the search itself became tradition. And now you are standing in front of me, making jokes. Coping mechanism, Calder said quietly. Very human. Comes free with the species. Silence. The station breathed its mechanical breath. Gerald the drone bumped into a wall somewhere down the corridor. And Calder stood there, looking at a woman who had grown up hearing stories about him. About the brave human doctor who stayed behind, who sacrificed everything, who died so others could live. Except he hadn't died. He had just hidden. You should know. Lyrian said, I didn't come here looking for you. He blinked. What? I was tracking a biosignal anomaly, a medical signature flagged in routine monitoring. It matched records from the plague archives, records connected to you. She held up the device. I thought it was a data error, a ghost in the system. I came to verify. She looked at him, at the scar, at the face that matched a dead man's. It wasn't a ghost. Calder stared at her, processing. She hadn't come for him. This wasn't a rescue, wasn't a mission. It was an accident. A coincidence so precise it felt like the universe was making a joke at both their expenses. So, he said, you followed a weird data blip to a forgotten station and found the dead man your mother spent 30 years mourning. Yes. That's impossible. I was going to say inconvenient, Calder said. But sure, impossible works too. Lyrian let out a breath, long, shaky, the sound of someone recalibrating their entire understanding of reality. You're coming with me, she said. Calder blinked. That sounded less like a request and more like a kidnapping. You can walk, she said. I promise. He considered running, briefly. The way you consider an option you know is stupid, but your legs bring up anyway. Run where? The station was a dead end in every direction. And if a queen had been searching for him for 30 years, the consequences were not something he could outrun. He looked around the corridor, at the humming lights, at the empty halls, at the life he had built here, which wasn't a life at all, just a hiding place shaped like one. Fine, he said, but if this turns out to be an elaborate prank, I'm filing a formal complaint with reality. The transport capsule moved with the gentle arrogance of technology that knew it would not fail. It pulled away from the station in silence, stars stretching into thin, bright lines before snapping back into place, as if the universe were politely clearing its throat before speaking. Calder sat strapped into a seat designed for someone with longer legs and better posture. He fidgeted, shifted, tried to find a position that didn't make his spine feel like it was filing a grievance. Failed. Lyrian sat opposite him, hands folded, eyes fixed on his face, unblinking, the way someone watches a candle in a room full of wind. This is making me nervous, Calder said. I don't usually get stared at this intensely unless I've spilled coffee on myself. I'm making sure you're real, she said. I assure you, if I weren't real, I'd be doing something far more impressive than sitting in a slightly too small chair. She almost smiled. Almost. The kind of almost that makes you realize how much someone is holding back. Then the seriousness returned, heavier now, layered with things she hadn't said yet. You look the same, she said quietly. Exactly the same as in the medical recordings. Calder leaned his head back, closed his eyes for a moment. You know, when people say that, they usually mean you've aged gracefully, not you're a violation of biological law. How? One word, but it carried everything. Long story, and he said, bad decisions, good luck, the usual human recipe. She waited. He sighed. I'll tell you, but not yet. It's the kind of story that needs context, and probably alcohol. We don't have alcohol on this vessel. Then context will have to do. The capsule hummed. Outside. Space folded and unfolded. Stars became streaks, became stars again. The transition to faster-than-light travel hit his stomach like a slow-motion elevator drop. You know, Calder said, gripping the armrest. Humans like to pretend we're used to this. We're really not. You've traveled interstellar routes before. Yes, I've also fallen downstairs before. Doesn't mean I enjoy it. That got a smile. Brief, genuine, gone before it fully formed, but real. And Calder noticed it the way you notice a crack of light under a closed door. Tell me, he said, what happened after Caro? Lyrian's expression shifted. She looked out the viewport, at the blur of folded space, liquid glass streaked with light. My mother survived, she said, because of you. She was the youngest member of the Cytheran delegation, barely older than I am now. The plague hit the station during a diplomatic transit. Half the delegation died in the first week. Calder remembered. Not the politics, not the names, but the dying, the endless dying. Bodies in corridors, the medical bay overflowing, the sound of ventilators running out of filters. She was brought to your ward, Lyrian continued, half conscious, fever past survivable levels. You were the only human doctor still working. The others had evacuated or collapsed. There was another, Calder said quietly. Harlan. He stayed too. The name came out before he could stop it, and once it was in the air, it sat there, heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. Lyrian looked at him. The records mention a second human physician, but only briefly. I wasn't brief, Calder said. He was my best friend. Silence. The kind that tells you something important is coming, but not yet. Lyrian continued. After the plague was contained, after you were declared dead, my mother returned home. She became queen within 2 years, and the first thing she did, the very first decree of her reign, was to build a medical network across 6 systems, in your name. Calder stared at her. The Calder Protocol, Lyrian said. Cross-species emergency medical response. Open borders for plague intervention. Free treatment, regardless of origin or status. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. She named hospitals after you, Lyrian said. Medical academies, relief fleets. There is a holiday in some sectors. I don't even like birthdays, Calder managed. You became a symbol, she said. The human who crossed species boundaries, who treated aliens as equals when his own kind had left, who paid with his life. He looked down at his hands, the same hands, unchanged, 30 years of hiding, and out there, without his knowledge, without his permission, he had become a story, a saint, a dead hero pinned to a legacy he never chose. Well, he said, voice rough, I feel terrible about ruining that narrative. You should, Lyrian said, but her tone was gentle, gentler than the words. Your mother, Calder said. What is she like, Lyrian considered. Strong, stubborn, impossible to argue with. She laughs rarely but completely. She reads medical journals for pleasure, which my father found baffling. He died 12 years ago. I'm sorry. He was a good man, patient, The kind of person who understood that loving my mother meant sharing her with a ghost. Calder winced. That's a heavy thing to compete with. He never competed, Lyrian said. He just loved her, and she loved him. But there was always a part of her that lived in that plague ward. With you, with the memory of what you did. The capsule shuddered gently. Deceleration. The stars began to slow, to separate, to become individual points of light again. And somewhere behind Calder's ribs, something he hadn't felt in a very long time began to ache. Not pain exactly, more like circulation returning to a limb that had been numb for decades. He had not been cared about in 30 years. Not really. Not by anyone who knew his real name. He had been liked, appreciated, thanked for his work, but cared about. The kind of caring that follows you home and checks on you and remembers your name when you're gone. That had been Harlan's department. And after Harlan, there was no one. Until now. Until a woman he had never met was sitting across from him in a capsule, telling him that her mother had built a world around his memory, that his name was spoken in hospitals, that children learned the word sacrifice and were told his story. He didn't deserve it. He knew that. But he also knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent decades alone, that deserving was not the point. Connection was not something you earned. It was something you accepted or refused, and he had been refusing for 30 years. He didn't tell her about Harlan right away, because some stories need to be approached sideways. Like a wound you can't touch directly. You talk around it, you get close, then you back away, then you try again. But the memories came anyway, uninvited, the way they always did when someone mentioned Cairo. 30 years earlier, Cairo Station, the plague ward. The air tasted like metal and disinfectant and fear. Calder was 32 years old and he had been awake for 41 hours. His hands shook, not from cold, from caffeine and terror, and the particular exhaustion that comes from watching people die faster than you can learn why. Harlan was across the ward, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who looked like he should be building houses, not treating microcellular pathogens. He had hands like shovels in the gentlest bedside manner Calder had ever seen. Patients loved him. They'd be dying, literally dying, and Harlan would sit beside them and say something stupid and kind, and they'd laugh. Laugh while dying. That was Harlan's gift. Bed 7 is gone, Harlan said, walking over, wiping his hands on a cloth that was already stained beyond cleaning. His voice flat, the voice of a man who had delivered the same news too many times to feel it anymore. When 20 minutes ago, I stayed. Of course he stayed. Harlan always stayed. Calder pulled up the patient log. Numbers on a screen, each one a person, each one a failure. The pathogen was adaptive. It mutated faster than anything in the medical literature. Every treatment they tried worked for 6 hours. Then the virus learned it, changed, came back stronger, like fighting something that could read your mind. We're losing, Calder said. We've been losing, Harlan corrected. But there's losing and there's giving up, and we haven't done that second one yet. That was Harlan, stubborn optimist wrapped in a realist body. He'd admit the building was on fire, then hand you a bucket and start walking toward the flames. They worked through the night, and the next night. On day 4, a Cytheran child, maybe 6 years old by human equivalence, stopped breathing in Harlan's arms. Harlan sat on the floor afterward, just sat, didn't speak for 20 minutes. Then he stood up, washed his hands, and walked to the next bed. That was the thing about Harlan. He broke, and then he kept going, like breaking was just something that happened between patients. A pause in the work, not a reason to stop. On day 7, the station's water recyclers failed. They had to ration, 2 liters per person per day. Calder gave his ration to a patient who was delirious and wouldn't stop asking for water in a language he didn't speak. Harlan saw him do it and said nothing, just handed Calder half of his own ration later, without comment. That was also Harlan. On day 8, the morgue was full. They started sealing bodies in empty cargo containers, marking them with names and species and dates. Because even in disaster, even in the worst of it, you write things down, you record, you bear witness. That is what doctors do when they can't do anything else. The evacuation order came on day 9, a station-wide alert, all non-essential personnel to departure bays, immediate withdrawal. Calder remembered the sound of it, the calm mechanical voice announcing the end of everything as if it were a schedule change. "We should go," Harlan said, but the ward was full. 43 patients, 12 critical, 3 of them alien delegates who couldn't be moved without specialized equipment that had already been loaded onto evacuation shuttles, including a young Scytheran woman with green-tinged skin who was burning alive with fever and looking at Calder with eyes that said, "Please," not in words, just in the way they stayed open, refusing to close. "I'm staying," Calder said. Harlan looked at him, long, measured, the kind of look that happens between two people who have spent years reading each other's silences. "Then I'm staying." "You don't have to." "Yeah, I know, that's what makes it noble, don't ruin it." So they stayed, while the station emptied, while the evacuation shuttles pulled away one by one, while the quarantine walls sealed and the automated systems began their shutdown sequence. 2 doctors, 43 patients, and a pathogen that was winning. Calder worked, desperately, pulling data from every source he could access. Alien medical databases, experimental compound libraries. He found fragments, partial solutions, nothing complete, nothing safe, but something, a possibility, a crude, reckless, absolutely insane possibility. "You're not serious," Harlan said, reading over his shoulder. "It's a cellular resilience modifier, forces the body's repair systems into overdrive. If it works, it could buy enough time for the immune response to catch up. If it works, yes. And if it doesn't?" Calder didn't answer that. "You haven't tested it," Harlan said. "There's no time to test it." "On who then?" "The patients, people who are already dying. You're going to give them an untested compound and hope for the best." Calder looked at him. "On me." Harlan's face went through something complicated. Anger, fear, respect, more anger. That's not science, that's suicide with extra steps. It's the only option that doesn't involve experimenting on people who can't consent. You can't consent either. You're sleep-deprived and emotionally compromised. "Then I'm the perfect test subject, very on brand for humans." Harlan didn't laugh. He stood, jaw tight, eyes red from exhaustion and something worse. And Calder saw, for the first time, that Harlan was afraid. Not of the plague, not of dying, of losing his friend to a decision that couldn't be undone. "Let me do it," Harlan said. "Quiet, steady. Test it on me instead." "No." "Calder. No, this is my formula, my mess, my risk. That's not how partnership works. It's how this one works. Tonight." Harlan stared at him. Then he nodded. Once. The nod of a man accepting something he hates. Calder synthesized the compound in the station's failing lab. Hands shaking, mind racing, every part of him screaming that this was too fast, too crude, too desperate. He injected it into his own arm at 0347 station time and waited. The fever came first, fast, violent, like his blood had caught fire. He collapsed against the lab bench. Harlan caught him, lowered him to the floor, said things Calder couldn't hear over the roaring in his ears. Then the hallucinations, colors that didn't exist, sounds that had no source. He saw his mother. He saw childhood. He saw the face of every patient who had died on his watch, all of them looking at him, not angry, just waiting, waiting to see if this one mattered. Hours passed, maybe days. Time became meaningless. Calder existed in a space between alive and not. A biological negotiation happening at the cellular level. His body deciding, without his input, whether to accept the modification or reject it, whether to live or finish dying. He woke up alone. The quarantine ward was empty. The lights were on emergency power, red and dim and pulsing. He was on the floor of the lab, covered in sweat, head splitting, alive, alive. He pulled himself up, checked his vitals. The fever was gone. The pathogen markers in his blood were suppressed, not eliminated, but held, controlled. His cells were doing something new, something the compound had triggered, a repair cycle that ran faster than degradation. It worked. He stumbled to the ward and started treating patients, one by one, adjusting the compound, stabilizing, improvising. The young Satharan woman with the green skin, he treated her last because she was the most critical, because the dosage needed to be different for alien physiology, because he was terrified of getting it wrong. He held her hand while the compound took effect, watched her fever break, watched her eyes focus, watched her breathe. She lived. And Harlan was in the secondary ward. He had been managing patients alone while Calder was unconscious, running fluids, checking vitals, doing everything, by himself, for hours. Calder found him at bed 12, sitting in a chair, head back, eyes closed. Harlan, no response. Harlan, nothing. The pathogen had adapted again, one final mutation, fast enough to outrun everything they had. And Harlan, who had been exposed the longest, who had no compound in his veins, who had spent hours in an enclosed ward with the worst cases. Harlan was gone. Calder stood there, in the red light, holding the hand of a man who had been alive 3 hours ago, who had said, "Let me do it," who had offered to take the needle, who would have survived if Calder had said yes, if Calder had said yes. That was the thought that would follow him for 30 years. Not the plague, not the miracle, not the impossible survival, the simple, unbearable, inescapable fact that his best friend offered to take the risk. And Calder, out of pride or principle or some desperate need to be the one who paid the price, had said no, and Harlan paid it instead. The capsule began its descent. Calder hadn't spoken in several minutes. Lyrian watched him, not with the burning intensity from before, something quieter now. The kind of watching that says, "I can see you're somewhere else, and I'll wait." "You mentioned Harlan," she said softly. "Yes." "What happened to him?" Calder looked at her, at this woman who had grown up with stories of him, the hero, the saint, the man who gave everything. "He died," Calder said, "because of me." Lyrian was quiet. "I kept him there. When the evacuation order came, he wanted to leave, and I said I was staying. And because he was Harlan, because he was loyal and stupid and brave, in the way that only people who love you can be, he stayed too." The words came out steady, practiced. He had said them before, but only to himself, in dark rooms, on quiet stations, in the space between sleep and morning where honesty lives because there's no one around to hear it. "The compound worked on me," he said. "It didn't work on him because I wouldn't let him take it first. I was so sure, so absolutely certain that I should be the one to risk it. And by the time it worked, by the time I could have given it to him, the pathogen had already changed, and he was gone." Silence. "So when your mother tells the story of the hero who sacrificed everything on Cairo Station," Calder said, "she's talking about a man who saved her life and failed to save the person who mattered most to him because he was too proud to share the risk." Lyrian's eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. Not this time. This time she just looked at him with something that wasn't pity, wasn't judgment, understanding. Maybe. Or maybe just the recognition that heroes are never what the stories say they are. You carried this, she said, for 30 years. Carrying implies I've been moving forward, Calder said. I've just been standing still, holding it. The planet filled the viewport now, vast, blue-green, streaked with oceans and city lights. A world that had built hospitals in his name, memorials in his honor, a holiday, a protocol, a legacy. And he was looking at it through the glass, thinking about a man in a chair, head back, eyes closed, a man whose name was barely a footnote in the records that made Calder a saint. Harlan. Your mother survived because of what happened on Cairo, Calder said. But someone died for it too. And it wasn't me. I just got the credit and the punishment of keeping going. Lyrian reached across the gap between their seats and placed her hand on his. Light, brief. The kind of touch that says I heard you, and it matters. Then she pulled back. My mother needs to hear this, she said. I know, Calder said. The capsule descended through the atmosphere. The first clouds parted around them, and below, growing larger with every second. A world rose to meet them, a world built on the memory of a dead man, who wasn't dead, who had never stopped dying, not from the plague, not from time, but from the quiet, relentless weight of knowing that the wrong person survived. The landing systems engaged, the capsule steadied, and Calder watched the ground approach with the strange calm of a man who had finally run out of places to hide. So, he said, forcing lightness back into his voice, because that was what he did, what he had always done. Build small walls out of humor and hope. Nobody noticed the cracks. What's the protocol for meeting a queen who thinks you've been dead for 30 years? Lyrian looked at him, and for the first time, her expression held something beyond grief and shock and disbelief. It was warmth. Try not to faint, she said, and don't make jokes during the first ceremonial silence. I'm already failing, Calder said. She smiled, small, real, and just enough. The ship touched down, and the doors opened, and the world rushed in, warm air and strange flowers and the sound of a civilization that had been waiting, without knowing it, for a dead man to come home. Calder stood, straightened his wrinkled jacket, brushed the crumbs from his sleeve, and walked forward, into whatever came next. Because running, he had finally learned, was just a slower way of standing still. The medical wing smelled like antiseptic and ozone, which Calder found reassuring in a deeply unromantic way. It meant things were clean, regulated, unlikely to explode without warning. He had spent enough time in failing medical bays to appreciate the ones that functioned properly, the ones with lights that didn't flicker, with equipment that didn't hum ominously before sparking. This one was beautiful, in a way that made him uncomfortable. The walls curved upward into a ceiling that shifted color with the ambient light. Soft blues, pale golds, the kind of design meant to soothe patients, to remind them that someone cared enough to make a hospital look like the inside of a seashell. Calder's hospitals had looked like storage closets with extra tubing. He lay on a hovering examination platform that adjusted itself every time he shifted, tilting slightly, recalibrating, as if mildly offended by his inability to stay still. Stop moving, said the physician, thin, silver-skinned, 4 fingers on each hand tapping rapidly on a translucent console that floated in the air beside him. His ears were shorter than Lyrian's, but still unmistakably non-human. His name was something Calder couldn't pronounce, so his brain had quietly filed him under Dr. Silver, which felt rude, but also accurate. I'm sorry, Calder said. My cells have always been attention seekers. Dr. Silver did not smile. He did not acknowledge the joke at all, which was either a cultural difference or a professional choice. Calder respected both. Lyrian stood near the wall, arms folded, watching everything with the focused intensity of someone who had not slept in too long and was running on urgency instead. She had not left his side since they landed, as if proximity alone might prevent him from vanishing again. Calder understood the impulse. He was the kind of man who had made disappearing into an art form. 11 identities, 11 lives, 11 sets of belongings left behind in rooms he would never return to. Trust was not something he inspired in people who knew his history. It was something he had to earn, again, every time. And he was starting to understand that earning it meant staying long enough for it to matter, which was terrifying, because staying was the one thing he had never been good at. The platform hummed. Scanners passed over his body in waves. Light and heat and something else he couldn't name. A tingling that moved through his bones like a whisper. Then the projections appeared. His body, rendered in light, floating above the platform in translucent layers. Organs, tissues, molecular structures, all rotating slowly, beautifully, and according to the increasingly unsettled expressions of the medical staff. Very incorrectly, Dr. Silver leaned forward, frowned, leaned closer, tapped something, frowned harder. Calder knew that sequence. He had done it himself 1,000 times. The scientist's version of what the hell. "This is impossible," another physician muttered. Younger, green-skinned, standing behind Dr. Silver like a shadow with opinions. Calder raised a hand slightly. "In my defense, I've been told that before, usually right before someone tries to write a paper about me." Dr. Silver ignored him. Definitely a professional choice. "Cellular degradation is present," he said, pointing at a magnified projection. "But it is delayed, suspended. Your telomeres regenerate faster than they erode." Lyrian frowned. "Explain that like I'm not surrounded by geniuses." Dr. Silver hesitated. The hesitation of a man choosing between precision and clarity. "He should be old," he said simply, "or dead. Instead, his body behaves as though time has been politely asked to wait outside." Nobody laughed, which was fair. It wasn't the kind of moment that needed laughter. It was the kind that needed silence. And got it. They ran more tests. Blood samples disappeared into humming machines. Nanoscopic probes traced neural pathways with an intimacy Calder found unsettling. At one point, something pinched the back of his neck and he flinched hard enough to make the platform wobble. "A warning would be nice," he said to the air. The air did not apologize. Then the results converged. Dr. Silver pulled up a chemical profile. A complex web of molecular structures rendered in soft light. Some Calder recognized. Most he did not. But the shape of it, the pattern, it was familiar, crude, improvised, desperate. "These compounds," Dr. Silver said, "they are not part of standard human medicine. Crude, experimental, desperately improvised." Calder stared at the projection. "That actually sounds like me." Lyrian's eyes widened. "During the plague, you mentioned unstable treatments." "I was running out of options," Calder said. "The pathogen adapted faster than anything I'd seen. We were losing people by the hour. I found a way to force cellular resilience. Temporarily, I thought." He paused. "I tested it on myself because ethically, that was the least bad option." The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone present realizes they are standing inside a moment that will be discussed for a very long time. "You altered your own biology," Dr. Silver said. Awe and disbelief tangled together in his voice. "Without approval." "Very without approval," Calder confirmed. "If there were forms, I ignored them." Lyrian stared at him. "And you never checked the long-term effects." "I checked that I was still breathing," Calder said. "After that, life got busy." Dr. Silver magnified a deeper layer. Calder's cellular structure expanded above them like a galaxy made of biology. And there, woven into the fabric of his cells, were the compounds, integrated, permanent, part of him. "The compounds rewrote how your body repairs itself," Dr. Silver said. "You didn't just survive the plague, you escaped aging." Calder let out a short laugh. quiet, incredulous. You make it sound like I planned it. You didn't, Lyrian asked. I was hoping for a week of not dying, he said. Maybe a month if I was lucky. Immortality was not on the checklist. Technically, Dr. Silver said, and Calder braced himself, because sentences that start with technically never end well. You are not immortal. You can still be injured, killed, just not by time. Well, Calder said, that's a relief. I'd hate to be invincible. The expectations would be exhausting. Lyrian shook her head, half stunned, half amazed. Do you know what this means? That I need to start lying about my age more creatively. She ignored that. My mother mourned you. The galaxy honored you. And you spent 30 years alone. The word alone hit differently than hiding would have. Because it was truer. He hadn't just hidden, he had been alone. Completely, relentlessly. The kind of alone that stops feeling like a condition and starts feeling like an identity. Humans notice when you don't age, Calder said quietly. They ask questions. Governments get interested. Eventually, someone decides your property. He looked around the room, at the projections, the data streams, the physicians with their expressions caught between excitement and concern. And now, Lyrian said softly, now I'm surrounded by very polite people deciding what I am. Dr. Silver cleared his throat. You are not property, but you are significant. Calder grimaced. I was afraid you'd say that. The platform lowered. End of examination. The projections faded, but the data remained. Stored, cataloged, evidence of something that should not exist. You should rest, Dr. Silver said. Your body may not age normally, but stress still applies. Good to know some things are still familiar. As they left the medical wing, Lyrian walked beside him in silence. The long kind. The kind that has weight and texture. Just existing. The way silence does between people who have shared something large and haven't yet figured out what to do with it. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or be afraid of what came next. Probably both. The palace had announced itself long before they arrived, rising from the planet's surface like a thought that had taken centuries to finish forming. Vast, layered, grown rather than built. The walls were living alloy, shifting subtly with light and gravity in the presence of people who moved through them. Guards waited in ceremonial formation at the entrance, their armor elegant rather than threatening, though Calder suspected it could become the opposite very quickly if he said the wrong thing. He leaned toward Lyrian. If I trip, do I pretend it's a human custom? You will be blamed for it regardless, she replied. So yes. They walked. The interior halls were long and bright, illuminated by panels that responded to movement and pulse, glowing faintly warmer as Calder passed. He tried not to read too much into that. The last thing he needed was a palace deciding it liked him, but the warmth followed him. All the way through the corridors, past diplomats who stared, past staff who whispered, past children who pointed at the human in the wrinkled jacket and were quickly shushed by adults who didn't know what to say either. At the end of the final corridor, massive doors stood open. Queen Alara did not sit on a throne. This surprised Calder. He had expected grandeur, the kind of elaborate staging that powerful people used to remind everyone else of the distance between them. Instead, she waited in a private chamber. No guards, no symbols, no crown. Just a room with soft light and wide windows overlooking gardens that stretched toward a horizon he couldn't measure. And a woman, standing at the center of it. She was old, not fragile, old the way mountains are old, with weight and presence in the particular stillness of someone who has endured enough to stop flinching at new things. Her skin carried the green undertone of her species, deeper than Lyrian's, more pronounced. Lines etched across her face like rivers on a map. Her ears were long, heavy with time. Her hair was silver, not styled, just released, as if vanity had been set aside decades ago in favor of more important things. Her eyes were fixed on Calder, and in those eyes, He saw it all. 30 years of it. The mourning, the searching, the building, the letting go, the holding on, the impossible alchemy of loving a dead man and knowing that love was the foundation of everything she had become. He had rehearsed several opening lines on the walk over. Clever things, charming things, the kind of verbal deflections that had kept him safe his entire life. They all vanished. So, he said, because panic had always favored honesty. This is awkward. A murmur rippled through the room. Surprise more than disapproval. Lyrian, standing behind her mother, made a face that clearly communicated, I warned you about this. Alara stood slowly. Each step she took toward him felt measured against 30 years of memory. When she stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the faint tremor in her hands, she did not reach out. You look, she said quietly, exactly the same. Calder swallowed. You look alive, which I hear is popular. Her lips curved, barely, the ghost of a smile passing through. I imagined this moment many times, she said. None of the versions included you making jokes. I use them defensively, he said, like armor, except lighter and less effective. She studied his face, searching for something he couldn't name. Confirmation, contradiction, permission to believe that the impossible thing standing in front of her was real and breathing and wearing a wrinkled jacket with a fraying cuff. I watched you die, she said. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. I held your hand while the fever took you. I felt your pulse stop. Calder stood very still. I came back. I'm not sure how convincing that is as an explanation. A sound escaped her, something caught between disbelief and release, like a dam cracking, not breaking, just letting the first thin stream of water through. For 30 years, she said, you were my proof that gratitude could outlive loss. That's a lot of responsibility, Calder said, for someone who can't even commit to a haircut. Lyrian inhaled sharply behind them. Alara looked at her daughter, then back at Calder. You were younger than I was. Now you stand before me unchanged, while time has taken its full measure from me. Time and I had a disagreement, Calder said. It left me alone after that. She stepped closer, close enough that the past pressed in around them. Dense, tangible, 30 years of it filling the space between two people who had last seen each other in a plague ward, when one of them was dying and the other was already dead. You saved my life, she said, and in doing so, you changed the course of my people. Do you understand that I understand medicine, Calder said. Politics was never my strength. And yet, she said, you became part of it, whether you wanted to or not. He looked at her, not as a queen, not as a symbol, as a woman who had built an entire world on the foundation of gratitude and loss, who had carried his memory like a compass, letting it guide her decisions, her policies, her reign. I'm sorry I didn't come back, he said. And for once, there was no joke behind it, no deflection. I didn't know how to exist anymore. Her eyes softened. I waited, she said, longer than was wise. That seems to be a theme. And then, and quietly, in the soft light of the chamber, with her daughter watching and the gardens glowing outside, Queen Alara did something Calder did not expect. She laughed, really laughed, the kind that fills a room and changes its temperature, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and old and tired and still, somehow, alive. You haven't changed, she said, not where it matters. Calder smiled, small, all genuine, the first real smile in a long time. You have, he said, but I think that's allowed. She told him alone, late that night, after dinner. After the formal introductions, in the diplomatic protocols, in the hours of carefully managed conversation where everyone pretended this was normal. It was not normal. They sat in her private study, a room filled with screens and data streams, and the quiet hum of a woman who had never stopped working, even now, even after everything. She was reviewing something on a floating console when Calder sat across from her, and she said it, simply, without preamble, the way you deliver news that has been sitting inside you for years, quietly rotting, waiting. I knew you were alive. Calder blinked. 10 years ago, Alara said, a routine medical scan across the Tethys systems flagged a biosignal, human, male, matching your genetic markers exactly. The probability of a false positive was less than 1 in 9 billion. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked like a man whose brain had received information it was not prepared to process. You knew. Yes. For 10 years. Yes. And you didn't? I ordered the data erased, Alara said, pulled the scan team off rotation, classified the finding under sealed archives, and stopped the search. Silence. The kind that doesn't just fill a room, it replaces everything else in it. Air, light, sound, all gone. Just silence and two people sitting in it. Why? Calder said. Alara looked at him, and two people sitting in it. Why? Calder said. Alara looked at him, and for the first time since he had arrived, she looked tired, not physically, something deeper, the exhaustion of carrying a decision that has no good answer, only less bad ones. Because if the galaxy knew you were alive, she said, they would come for you. He stared. You were a symbol, a martyr, the human who gave everything. If they discovered you survived, unchanged, unaged, with an experimental compound in your blood that rewrote cellular biology. She paused. You would not be a man anymore. You would be a resource. Calder felt something cold move through him. Not surprise, recognition, because he had known this, had lived inside this fear for 30 years, had structured his entire existence around avoiding exactly what she was describing. And she had known it too, for a decade. And instead of finding him, instead of bringing him home, she had done the one thing no one expected a queen who had searched for 30 years to do. She had let him go. The search, Calder said slowly, the famous search, the one that became tradition, the one everyone knows about. Continued, Alara said, publicly, loudly, in every system, because as long as the galaxy believed I was still looking for a dead man, no one would think to look for a living one. The search wasn't a search, it was a shield. 30 years of mourning, public memorials, state ceremonies, holidays in his name, and behind it all, for the last 10 years, a queen who knew exactly where he was and chose, every single day, to leave him alone, because she understood, better than anyone, what would happen if the wrong people found out that death hadn't managed to hold him. Lyrian doesn't know, Calder said. No, you lied to your daughter. I protected you both, by letting her believe I was dead, by letting the galaxy believe you were dead, Lyrian included, because my daughter, brilliant as she is, cannot lie convincingly, and if she had known, someone would have seen it in her face. Calder sat back, hands on his knees, staring at the ceiling, processing, reprocessing, trying to fit this new information into the architecture of everything he thought he understood. She had found him and chosen not to claim him. She had grieved publicly, while knowing privately that the grief was performance. She had built a legacy on his sacrifice, while knowing the sacrifice was incomplete. You carried this, he said, for 10 years. Yes, alone. A queen is always alone. You just choose which loneliness to carry. She had loved him enough to leave him lost. Calder tried to imagine it. 10 years, 3,650 days of knowing someone you cared about was alive, and choosing not to reach for them, choosing silence over reunion, every morning waking up and deciding again, today I will not call him. Today I will let him stay hidden. Today I will carry this alone. He tried to imagine the discipline that required, the cost. He couldn't. Did you ever come close, he asked. to telling someone, to breaking. She was quiet for a long time. Then, once, 5 years ago, there was a memorial ceremony. Your name was read aloud. Lyrian was standing beside me. She was crying, and I wanted to lean over and say, he's alive. He's on a station in the Tethys corridor. He talks to maintenance drones and eats terrible protein bars, and he's alive. She paused, her voice steady but thin, like ice that holds your weight, but you can hear it cracking underneath. I didn't, but I wanted to, more than I have ever wanted anything in my life. I don't know whether to thank you, Calder said, or be angry. Both is fine, Elara said. I've had 10 years to be both. He laughed, short, sharp, the kind of laugh that happens when emotion has nowhere else to go. You're remarkable, he said. I'm tired, she said. And that, more than anything, broke something open in him, because he knew that word, knew it from the inside. The particular fatigue of holding a truth that no one else is carrying. For years, without rest. He reached across the table and placed his hand on hers. She didn't pull away. They stayed like that, in the quiet, in the truth. Two people who had been separated by 30 years and a lie that was also an act of love. Now, Elara said, we deal with the council. Calder groaned. I was hoping you wouldn't say that. The council chamber was circular, designed, Calder assumed, to encourage equality, but mostly succeeding in making it impossible to tell who was judging you the hardest. He stood at the center, hands loosely clasped behind his back, trying to look like a person who belonged there rather than a man who had wandered into galactic politics by accident. Around him, representatives of 6 systems, watching, some with curiosity, some with the particular focus of people calculating the value of what they were looking at. Elara sat at her position among them, composed, unreadable. Lyrian stood behind her, arms crossed, expression daring anyone to be disrespectful. Calder cleared his throat. Before anyone asks, he said, I don't glow, don't regenerate limbs, and don't grant wishes. I'm just very bad at aging. A ripple of quiet amusement, brief, polite, the diplomatic equivalent of a courtesy laugh. Then a voice. You are an anomaly. It came from the far side of the chamber. A man, tall, thin, older than most in the room. His skin was dark, patterned with faint bioluminescent lines that pulsed slowly when he spoke. His ears were short for his species. His posture was rigid, not with ceremony, with control. Counselor Voss. Calder had been warned about him. By Lyrian, on the walk over, quick, hushed, the way you warn someone about a dog that bites. He's intelligent, he's principled, and he lost a daughter to a plague. Not Kiro, a different one. 12 years ago. A plague that some believe your compound, if shared, could have prevented. So not a villain. Something worse. A grieving father with a point. Your condition, Voss continued, could change medical science across multiple species. I'd prefer it didn't change me into a laboratory, Calder replied. I'm quite attached to my current organs. Humor, Voss said, not smiling. A common deflection among those avoiding difficult questions. Calder felt something tighten in his chest, the awareness of standing on ground that was about to shift. You hid for decades, Voss said. That suggests intent. That suggests fear, Calder corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Voss leaned forward. You possessed a compound that altered human biology at the cellular level. A compound that, by your own account, saved your life, and potentially the lives of dozens on Kiro Station. And instead of sharing that discovery, instead of offering it to the medical community, you vanished. The chamber was silent, listening. For 30 years, Voss said, while plagues continued, while species died, while children... He paused, the briefest break in his composure. A crack in glass you'd miss if you weren't looking. while children who might have been saved were not. Calder stood there, absorbing it, because Voss wasn't wrong. That was the terrible thing. The compound existed, in his blood, in his cells, a crude, accidental, desperately improvised miracle. And he had spent 3 decades keeping it to himself, not out of malice, out of fear. But fear and malice produce the same silence. And silence, when lives hang in the balance, has a cost. I understand your point, Calder said carefully, and I don't disagree with all of it. Alara's eyes flickered toward him. A tiny movement, warning, but Voss wasn't finished. I would like, Voss said, to enter evidence into the council record. Murmurs. Lyrian's posture shifted. Something in the room tightened, the way air tightens before a storm. A projection appeared at the center of the chamber. Medical records, personnel files, stamped with Kiro Station identifiers. Old, degraded at the edges, but legible. And there, in the center of the projection, a face. Harlan. Calder's breath stopped. Not a pause, a full stop. The kind where your body forgets it needs oxygen because something else has taken priority. Something like the past reaching up through the floor and grabbing you by the throat. Dr. Harlan Mercer, Voss read, human physician, stationed at Cairo during the plague outbreak, remained after evacuation orders, died on day 11 of quarantine. The projection expanded. Medical logs, treatment notes, timeline reconstructions. The records indicate, Voss continued, that Dr. Mercer remained on the station at your urging, that he was exposed to the pathogen for an extended period while you were incapacitated by the experimental compound, and that by the time you recovered, the pathogen had mutated beyond treatment. Every word a scalpel, precise, clean, drawing blood from places Calder had spent 30 years trying to protect. You had the compound, Voss said. You tested it on yourself. You survived. And your colleague, your partner, who also stayed, who also risked everything, did not receive it. Silence. Because you chose to be the subject, rather than share the risk. Calder couldn't speak. His mouth was open, but nothing came. Because Voss had done something worse than attack him. He had told the truth, a truth Calder had been carrying alone for 3 decades, spoken aloud in a room full of strangers, and it sounded exactly as bad as he had always feared it would. Your pride, Voss said, quiet now, almost gentle, which was worse. Or your principle, whichever word you prefer, cost a man his life, and then, rather than face that, you disappeared. The chamber waited. Lyrian was staring at Calder, her expression shifting, not to anger, to understanding, the terrible kind. The kind that comes when you realize the person you admired is more complicated than the story, more damaged, more real. So my question, Voss said, is not whether you are significant. You clearly are. My question is whether a man who chose himself over his partner and then hid for 30 years has the moral standing to decide what happens to a discovery that could save millions. Calder looked at him, at this man who had lost a daughter, who stood in a council chamber with bioluminescent lines pulsing beneath his skin, who was not cruel, not corrupt, just broken in a way that demanded accountability from the universe, and had chosen Calder as the nearest representative. You're right, Calder said. Lyrian flinched. Alara closed her eyes, briefly, the fraction of a second that in anyone else would be invisible. In a queen, it was a scream. About Harlan, Calder continued. You're right. I chose to test the compound on myself. I told him no when he offered, and he died because I was too proud, or too scared, or too convinced that the risk was mine to take alone. The chamber held its breath. But being right about the past, Calder said, doesn't make you right about the future. The compound worked on me by accident, by luck, by whatever combination of desperation and biology turned a crude experiment into something permanent. Replicating it without understanding it would kill people. The same way it almost killed me. The same way it failed to save Harlan. Voss didn't respond immediately. His bioluminescent lines pulsed, slowly. Then help us understand it, he said, willingly, openly, as the man you should have been 30 years ago. Before Calder could answer, Alara spoke. He did not know we were searching, she said, voice steady, carrying the full weight of a queen. Nor did he benefit from our mourning. He gave enough already. The words settled. Some counselors relaxed, others did not. Voss remained still, watching. The session ended, for now. Later, much later, after the corridors emptied and the diplomatic machinery went quiet, Calder learned just how right he had been to be afraid. He was on a balcony, overlooking the palace gardens. Night had deepened, the air warm and carrying scents he didn't recognize. Engineered flowers blooming in cycles that probably had mathematical names. Below, drones drifted between branches, maintaining ecosystems with the quiet precision of things that never tired. Lyrian found him there, leaned against the railing beside him. You handled that well, she said. I told a room full of politicians that I got my best friend killed. And you're saying I handled it well. You told the truth, in a room where no one expected it. That's rare here. It didn't feel rare. It felt like getting hit by a train. She studied him, sideways. They're afraid of what you represent. Yeah, Calder said. So am I. Quiet, comfortable, or close enough. My mother is struggling, Lyrian said softly. Not with seeing you, but with what it means. I froze in time, Calder said. She didn't. That's the unfair part. You paid differently. You lived between lives, watching everyone else move forward. It's overrated. She hesitated. Then, do you regret it? He considered. The question deserved an honest answer, which meant a slow one. Some days, other days I wake up and think, well, I'm still here. That feels like something, even if I'm not sure what. Footsteps behind them, soft, measured. Alara joined them on the balcony, the weight of rulership temporarily set aside. They want you to stay, she said, as an advisor, a symbol, a reminder. Calder sighed. I've never been good at being a reminder. I won't force you, not again. He met her gaze. I don't know where I belong anymore. That, she said, makes three of us. They stood together, watching the garden breathe, under alien stars. Then the palace security system chimed, sharp, insistent, the kind of sound that interrupted everything and apologized for nothing. Lyrian straightened immediately, touched a panel on her wrist, read something, and her face changed. Not shock, not surprise, fury. What is it? Alara said. A breach, Lyrian said. In the medical wing. Someone accessed the sealed examination data 15 minutes ago, downloaded cellular analysis, genetic markers, compound structure. Calder felt the ground shift under him, the feeling of a trap you knew was coming but hoped wouldn't. They have my DNA, he said. One of the attending physicians, Lyrian continued, reading fast. Dr. Veldrin, junior staff, assigned to the examination team this morning. His access terminal shows an unauthorized data transfer to an external relay, off-world. Where Alara said, voice flat, queen voice, the one that made rooms go cold, routing through 3 proxy stations. But the destination signature matches a known address, the Helior Medical Consortium. Calder knew the name. Everyone in the outer systems did. Helior was the largest private biomedical corporation across 4 sectors: research, development, patent, profit. They had been involved in plague response, vaccine distribution, and according to quieter sources, in biological acquisition programs that operated in the spaces between laws. They had his genetic code, his cellular structure, the blueprint for the compound that had rewritten his biology, everything he had spent 30 years keeping to himself, stolen in 15 minutes by a junior physician with access and a buyer. Calder felt it happen inside him, the old familiar shutdown. The part of his brain that had kept him alive for 3 decades activating like a system coming online. Run, the voice said. You know how to do this. You've done it 11 times. Pack nothing. Leave everything. Become no one again. Find another station. Another name. Another life that isn't a life. It would be so easy, so familiar. The grooves of that pattern worn so deep into him that slipping back in would feel less like a decision and more like gravity. But something held, something that hadn't been there before, something that felt like Lyrian's hand on his in the capsule, like Aelara's laugh filling a chamber, like the weight of being known after so long. By people who saw him and did not look away. He couldn't lose that. He had only just found it. Voss, Lyrian said, the name landing like a blade on stone. Aelara said nothing, which was worse. He argued so eloquently about sharing, Lyrian continued, bitterness threading through her voice, about the moral obligation of discovery. And while we debated ethics, someone on his recommendation list walked into our medical wing and took what they wanted. Calder stood very still. Still in the way. A man is still when he has lived inside a fear for 3 decades and the fear has just become real. And the shock is not that it happened, but that it feels exactly the way he always knew it would. Someone had looked at his body, seen a resource, and taken it. This is why I ran, he said quietly. Every time. This exact thing. Someone always decides that what you are is more important than who you are. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. Fine tremors, the kind you only see up close. So what do you do? Lyrian asked. Run again. He looked at her, at this woman who had found him by accident, who had cried in a corridor because a dead man was breathing, who had stood behind her mother and dared anyone to be disrespectful. And he looked at Aelara, who had known he was alive for 10 years, who had carried that secret alone, who had loved him enough to let him stay lost. And he thought about Harlan, who had offered to take the risk, who had stayed because Calder stayed, who had died because Calder said no. Harlan wouldn't have run. Harlan never ran. Last time I ran because I had no one, Calder said. Lyrian watched him, waiting. This time is different. She stepped toward him, close enough that the space between them felt deliberate, chosen. Then stay, she said, and fight. Below them. The garden lights shifted, night deepening, the universe continuing its slow rotation around a man who refused to age and a decision that refused to wait any longer. Calder looked at the stars, and for the first time in 30 years, he did not think about running. He thought about standing still, on purpose. Calder was awake before dawn, not lying in bed staring at the ceiling, not circling the same fears he had circled for decades. He was up, moving, walking through the palace corridors with the particular energy of a man who had made a decision and was afraid that if he slowed down, he might unmake it. They have your DNA. Yes, they have the compound. Yes, and you're going to do the one thing you've avoided your entire life. Tell the truth, all of it, to everyone. His hands were steady, which surprised him. He had expected them to shake, expected the old familiar tremor that came with exposure, with being seen. But they were still, as if his body had decided something before his mind caught up. Harlan's voice again, in his head, clear as always. About time. Yeah, about time. He stopped at a window in the corridor. Outside, the planet's surface was waking up, city lights dimming as dawn spread across the continents. Somewhere down there, hospitals bearing his name were opening their doors. Doctors trained in programs he had inspired were beginning their shifts. Patients were being treated under protocols built on the principle he had lived by without even knowing it had a name. Treat the person, not the species. He had done that once, in a plague ward, at 3 in the morning, while the world fell apart around him, and it had mattered. Not because of the compound, not because of the science, because he had stayed, because he had looked at a woman who was not human and seen only a person who needed help. That was his legacy, not the immortality, not the biology, the simple, stubborn choice to show up and stay. Harlan had taught him that, and now, 30 years late, he was finally going to honor it. He found Lyrian in the observation chamber. She was standing at the projection table, reviewing security data with the focused intensity of someone who had also not slept. The air around her thick with floating displays, communication logs, transfer routes, the digital fingerprints of the data breach tracing paths across star systems like cracks in glass. She looked up when he entered, read his face, and something shifted in hers. "You've decided something," she said. "Is it that obvious? You're standing differently." He looked down at himself. Same wrinkled jacket, same fraying cuff, same body that refused to match the calendar. But she was right. Something had changed, not in his posture exactly, in the weight behind it. "I want an open session," Calder said. Lyrian blinked. "Open the council, full broadcast, every system that can receive it. I want to address them publicly." She stared at him, waiting for the punchline. Because with Calder, there was usually a punchline, a deflection, a joke that let the pressure escape before it built into something real. Not this time. "You want to go public," she said, slowly, testing each word for structural integrity. "I want to tell the truth, all of it. Harlan, the compound, the hiding, why I ran, why I'm here, everything." That's stupid. I was going to say brave. Those are often the same thing. She set down the datapad, crossed her arms, studied him with the expression of someone evaluating a structure that might hold or might collapse, and deciding whether to trust it anyway. "Voss will use it," she said. "Everything you say publicly, he'll use it. I know. Helior will use it. The data is already out there. A public statement gives them context, makes the stolen data more valuable." "I know." "Then why?" Calder looked at her. "Because the alternative is running again. And I can't. Not anymore." She was quiet for a long time. "You know," she said finally, "in the stories, you were a quiet hero, selfless, stoic, never spoke more than necessary. The stories got a lot wrong." "I'm starting to think they got everything wrong," she said, "and I'm starting to think that's better." Alara said no. Then she said absolutely not. Then she said something in her own language that Calder didn't understand, but assumed was the diplomatic equivalent of, "Are you out of your mind?" They were in her study, the same room where she had told him about the 10 years, the same soft light, the same floating consoles, the same woman, sitting across from him, with the expression of someone who has spent a lifetime making careful decisions and is watching someone else choose the opposite. "You have no idea what this will do," she said. "I have some idea. You will become the most discussed human in the galaxy. Overnight, every faction, every government, every corporation with a biomedical division will have an opinion about you." "They already do," Calder said. "The difference is, right now they're forming those opinions without my input. I'd rather be part of the conversation than the subject of it. You cannot control a conversation that spans 6 systems." "No, but I can start it honestly." Alara leaned back, looked at the ceiling, the gesture of a queen who had run out of counter-arguments and was searching the architecture for more. "Harlan," she said. Calder tensed slightly. A reflex. The way you flinch when someone touches a bruise you forgot was there. You want to talk about him publicly. I need to. Why? Because Voss used him as a weapon, and if I don't take that weapon back, someone else will pick it up over and over. Every time someone wants leverage, they'll point to Harlan, to the choice I made, and I'll spend whatever years I have left defending a decision from when I was 32 and terrified and out of options. He met her eyes. I'd rather tell it myself, once, completely, and let it be done. Alara studied him, searching his face for something. She always seemed to be searching, every time they spoke. You are asking me, she said, to let you stand in front of the galaxy and tell them that the hero they mourned is flawed, that the sacrifice they honored was incomplete, that the man they built hospitals for couldn't save his own best friend. Yes, and you think this will help. I think the truth is already out. Voss put it in the record. Helior has the data. The only thing that isn't public yet is my voice. And if I don't use it now, someone else will tell the story for me, the way they always have. Silence. Silence, the Queen weighing costs. There is something else, she said. He waited. If you do this, if you speak publicly, I will need to address my own role. Their eyes met, and he understood. The 10 years, the secret, the decision to hide his survival. If Calder told the truth, Alara's truth came with it. You don't have to, he said. If you can be brave, she said. So can I. I've had more practice. He smiled, small, genuine. We're both terrible at protecting ourselves, he said. Yes, she agreed, but we're quite good at protecting each other. The chamber was full, not just the council. Every seat, every standing position, every corner occupied by someone who had heard through whatever channels gossip traveled that something unprecedented was about to happen. The broadcast arrays were active, blue lights pulsing gently on the walls, meaning that what happened in this room was being carried across 6 systems, to stations and colonies and ships and planets where people would stop what they were doing and listen to him, a man in a wrinkled jacket with a scar on his chin. Incredible. The things the universe chose to broadcast. He stood at the center of the circular chamber. Same spot, same architecture designed for equality, but different now because this time he wanted to be seen. Lyrian was at her mother's side. She had spent the morning helping Calder prepare, which mostly consisted of him writing and discarding opening lines while she told him each one was worse than the last. They had settled on nothing. He was going to speak from whatever was left inside him after 30 years of silence. Either it would be enough, or it wouldn't, but it would be his. Alara nodded. The chamber fell silent, and Calder began. My name is Calder, he said. I'm a human doctor, and 30 years ago, I was declared dead on Cairo Station. His voice was steady. He was surprised by that. He had expected the words to come out crooked and thin, but they came out clear, maybe because he was done being afraid of them. The records say I sacrificed my life to save patients during the plague, that I refused evacuation, that I stayed behind, that I died a hero. He paused. Some of that is true, most of it isn't. Silence. The breathless kind. The kind that happens when a room full of people realizes they are about to hear something that will rearrange what they know. I did stay. I did refuse evacuation. And I did treat patients, including a young Sitharan woman who would later become Queen Alara. I administered an experimental compound that I had synthesized under impossible conditions. It worked. She survived. Others survived. He took a breath. But I wasn't alone. There was another doctor. His name was Harlan Mercer. He was my colleague, my partner, my best friend. And he stayed because I stayed. Not because he had to, because he chose to, because that's the kind of man he was. The projection system responded to his words, pulling archival images, Cairo Station, the plague ward, medical logs, and somewhere in the data, A photograph. Harlan, smiling, broad and warm, in a way that made the room feel smaller and more human. When I synthesized the compound, Calder continued, I tested it on myself. Harlan offered to take the injection instead. He said, let me do it. And I said no, because I believed the risk was mine to take, because I was proud, or principled, or just too stubborn to share the danger with someone I loved. He stopped, looked at the photograph floating in the air. The compound worked on me. It saved my life. It rewrote my cellular biology in ways I still don't fully understand. And while I was unconscious, recovering, Harlan was alone, managing an entire ward of dying patients by himself. For hours, his voice held, but barely, like a rope pulled taut. He died while I slept because the pathogen mutated one final time, and he had no compound in his blood, no protection, no miracle, just himself, and it wasn't enough. The chamber was so quiet that Calder could hear his own heartbeat. I survived. Harlan didn't, and instead of facing that, I hid. 30 years, moving between stations, changing names, avoiding mirrors, telling myself I was protecting my freedom. But the truth is simpler and uglier. He looked at Voss directly, with the steady gaze of one grieving man recognizing another. I was ashamed of surviving, of aging wrong, of being the one who lived while the better man died. Voss did not move. His bioluminescent lines pulsed slowly, the rhythm of recognition. Counselor Voss asked me whether I have the moral standing to decide what happens to the compound in my blood. The answer is, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I'm not sure anyone is wise enough to answer that question alone. He turned slowly, addressing the full chamber. But I can tell you what the compound is, and what it isn't. It is not a cure. It is not a treatment. It is not a gift. It is an accident. A desperate, crude, barely functional experiment that I injected into my own arm at 3 in the morning because I had nothing left and people were dying. He let that settle. It worked on me, by luck, by some collision of timing and biology that I have spent 30 years unable to replicate even in theory. And if someone tries to reproduce it without understanding it, people will die, the way Harlan died, not from the plague, but from the cure. He looked at the broadcast indicators, blue lights pulsing, carrying his words across the void. I am not holding back a miracle. I am holding back a bomb that I happen to survive. And the difference between medicine and poison is understanding, which takes time and patience, and the kind of humility that says, we don't know enough yet. Silence, then he did something that surprised even himself. So here is what I'm offering. Every eye, every sensor, every broadcast relay, focused. My complete medical data, every scan, every sample, every analysis from the examination performed here, everything about the compound, about my cells, about the mechanism, all of it. Murmurs rising like wind through grass. Publicly available to every accredited research institution across every system under a framework of shared oversight, open study, transparent review. No single government, no single corporation, no single entity will own this research. It belongs to everyone, or it belongs to no one. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice changed, softer, more personal, as if he had forgotten about the broadcast entirely, as if he were talking to one person. And the research program will be named after Harlan Mercer. The photograph still floated in the air, that smile, the face of a man who would have stayed in any plague ward, on any station, for any reason, because that was simply who he was. Because he should have been the one standing here, Calder said. And since he can't, his name will be on every paper, every breakthrough, every life saved by whatever we learn from what happened to me. He doesn't get a second chance, but he gets to be part of what comes next. He stepped back from the center. Done. Empty in a way that felt like weightlessness. The absence of everything he'd been carrying. The chamber didn't erupt, didn't applaud. It did something more powerful. It sat with what he had said and absorbed it, somewhere in the room. A counselor pressed her hand to her chest, a gesture Calder didn't recognize, but understood instinctively. Acknowledgement, respect, the kind given to someone who has shown you something real at great personal cost. Lyrian was looking at him, eyes bright, jaw set, the expression of someone who was very proud and very determined not to cry about it. Alara, his queen, his patient from 30 years ago, the woman who had built a civilization on his ghost, was sitting perfectly still, hands folded, face unreadable. But her eyes were not unreadable at all. They were full, full the way oceans are full, with everything that has ever been poured into them. In Calder, standing at the center of a room that was broadcasting his failures across 6 star systems, felt something he had not felt in 30 years. Light, not physically, but inside. The particular lightness that comes from putting something down that you have carried for so long, you forgot it had weight. You just thought that was how bodies felt. Heavy, tired, bent. And then you set it down, and you stand up, and the world looks different from up here. Voss found him afterward, not in the chamber, in a corridor, because the important conversations never happen where they're supposed to. They happen in hallways and balconies and the spaces between rooms, where the architecture isn't watching. Calder saw him coming, considered various options, walking faster, pretending to be lost, developing a sudden interest in wall panels. He stayed. Voss stopped a few feet away. His bioluminescent lines were dim, barely pulsing, the biological equivalent of exhaustion. They looked at each other. "My daughter's name was Talia," Voss said. Calder didn't respond. He just listened, because some things don't need responses. They need witnesses. She was 19, studying medicine, because she believed, genuinely believed, that science could outrun suffering. Voss paused. The plague that took her was not Kiro. It was smaller, less famous, the kind that kills hundreds instead of thousands, the kind that doesn't get memorials. His voice was steady, but worn, like stone that has been rained on for years. I spent 12 years asking myself, what if the compound had been available? What if the research had been done? What if someone, anyone, had shared what they knew? And you looked at me, Calder said, and saw the answer, standing there making jokes. Yes, I understand. I know you do. Voss looked at him, really looked, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, not resolution, but the mutual recognition of 2 men standing on opposite sides of the same grief, looking at each other across the gap, and seeing not an enemy, just a mirror. You lost someone, Voss said. Yes. And you hid. Yes. I lost someone, and I fought. Yes. Neither of us got them back. Silence, long, heavy, full of everything that words can't carry. No, Calder said. We didn't. Voss nodded, once. The kind of nod that closes a chapter without pretending the book is finished. The DNA transfer, Calder said. The physician, Veldrin. I recommended him for the team, Voss said. I did not authorize the transfer. Calder studied him, looking for the lie, for the calculation. He found nothing, just a tired man standing in a corridor telling the truth. Helior approached him independently, Voss continued. I learned of it after the fact, and I should have reported it immediately. I didn't, because for one moment, I thought, maybe this is how it should happen. Maybe the compound gets out. Maybe someone replicates it. Maybe another father doesn't lose another daughter. And then I heard you speak about the bomb, about the difference between medicine and poison. His lines pulsed once, faintly, and I knew you were right. Not because the science was clear, but because Talia would have agreed with you. She believed in doing things properly, even when it was slow, even when it hurt. Calder felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he hadn't realized was there. Or maybe one he had been so aware of that it had become part of his anatomy. She sounds like Harlan, he said. Voss looked at him, and for the first time since they had met, something in his expression changed. The rigidity softened, the control loosened. He looked less like a counselor and more like a father, standing in a hallway, missing his daughter. Do you know what the worst part is? Voss said. Not the loss. You learn to carry the loss. The worst part is the moments when you forget, when you wake up and for 3 seconds, everything is normal, and then you remember, and it hits you again, fresh, every time. Calder knew. God, he knew. Harlan used to sing while he worked, Calder said. Badly, off-key, drove the nurses insane, and sometimes, in a quiet moment on a station somewhere, I'll hear someone humming, and for half a second I'll think it's him, and then it's not, and the day gets a little harder after that. Voss nodded, slowly, the nod of a man who had just heard his own grief described in someone else's language, and recognized every word. Perhaps, Voss said, perhaps the people we lose teach us the same lessons, just in different languages. They stood in the corridor, two grieving men, having the most honest conversation either of them had had in years. The council will handle Veldren, Voss said, and Helior will face formal sanctions. I'll see to it personally. Why? Because Talia would have wanted it done right. A beat. And because you were brave enough to stand up. I can at least be brave enough to clean up. Calder nodded. Thank you. Voss turned to leave, then stopped, half turned back. The research program, he said. The one named after your friend. Yes. I would like to be involved, if you'll allow it. Calder looked at him, at this man who had been his adversary 12 hours ago, who had used Harlan's death as a weapon, who had grieved so loudly it sounded like anger. Harlan would have liked you, Calder said. He had a weakness for stubborn people with good intentions. Something shifted in Voss's expression. Not a smile, but the possibility of one, somewhere distant, approaching slowly. Then it's decided, Voss said. He walked away, and Calder stood in the corridor, alone, but not lonely, for the first time. Those felt like different things. The last conversation happened at dusk. Aelara's private garden, not the public one with the engineered blooms and the mathematical pollination cycles. A smaller space, behind her quarters, where the plants grew however they wanted, where nothing was designed and nothing was performance. She was already there when Calder arrived, sitting on a bench that looked old enough to have opinions about the weather, her hands in her lap, face turned toward the sky, where two moons hung close enough to cast overlapping shadows. Calder sat beside her, not too close, not too far. The distance between two people who had carried each other for 30 years without ever being in the same room. The broadcast has reached 4 systems, she said. Reactions are mixed. Mixed is better than hostile. Some are calling you a fraud. Some are calling you a saint. Most are confused. That tracks, Calder said. I'm usually confused too. She turned to look at him, and in the half-light, with the moons above and the imperfect garden around them, she looked younger, not in her face, in her eyes, as if something behind them had been released. I told Lyrian, she said. Calder's chest tightened. About the 10 years. Yes, she deserved to know, especially after what you did in the chamber. How did she take it? Aelara's mouth curved faintly. She called me several things in 3 languages. Then she cried. Then she said she understood. Then she called me more things. That sounds about right. She's angry, but not the kind that lasts. The kind that comes from loving someone and learning they carried something alone when they didn't have to. Calder looked at the garden, at the unruly plants growing in directions no one had chosen, living without a plan. You protected me, he said. For 10 years, you knew I was alive. You could have brought me home, and instead, you let me stay lost. Yes. You watched your daughter grieve for a dead man who wasn't dead. You carried state ceremonies knowing they were performance. Yes. And you did it alone. Her hands trembled in her lap, something she had held so long it had become part of how she moved. There were nights, she said, when I wanted to call you, not to bring you back, just to hear you breathe, to know you were still out there, somewhere. Calder swallowed hard. Why didn't you? Because the moment I contacted you, the moment anyone knew, you would have been taken, studied, disassembled by people who saw your body as a puzzle rather than a person. She looked at him, eyes wet but steady, the eyes of a woman who had ruled through impossible choices and lived with everyone. You saved my life when I was young and dying in a quarantine ward, she said. Letting you live in peace was the only way I knew how to save yours in return. He reached over and took her hand. She gripped it, tight, the kind of tight that says, I've been holding on to something invisible for a decade, and now there's something real. They sat like that, in the imperfect garden, under 2 moons, while the broadcast carried his words across the stars, and the galaxy tried to decide what to do with a dead man who wouldn't stay dead. I've been thinking, Calder said. That's dangerous. About what comes next. She waited. I can't stay here, he said, gentle, not pulling away, just being honest. Not permanently. If I stay, I become a symbol again, and symbols don't get to live. They get displayed, maintained, referenced. I know, she said. I need to go back, to human space, not to hide this time, but to do what I should have done years ago. Work, teach, be present, let people know me, even if it means they notice eventually, even if it gets complicated. It will get complicated. Everything good is. She smiled, the kind of smile that has survived 30 years of loss and still remembers how. I've arranged passage, she said. New identity, one that won't raise questions for a while. For a while, Calder echoed. You could stay, she added. Here with us. He looked at her. At this woman who had been dying when he first saw her, who had built a kingdom while he hid, who had loved him enough to let him be forgotten. I don't think I was meant to stop moving, he said, but I don't want to run anymore either. Neither do I, she said. They talked then about practical things, communication relays, medical exchanges, the research framework, quiet agreements that would outlast both of them, or at least outlast one of them, because that was the cruelty they didn't mention, that she would age, and he would not, and whatever this was between them, this thing that had survived death and distance and a decade of chosen silence, it would end the way all things end, except for him. The past was no longer an accusation. It had become context, the soil that everything else grew from. They sat in silence for a while, the comfortable kind, the kind that happens when 2 people have said enough and the quiet is no longer an absence but a presence. Something shared, something warm. A nightbird called from somewhere in the garden, or whatever the alien equivalent of a nightbird was. Something with wings and opinions about the dark. You know, Aelara said, when I was young, before the plague, before any of it, I wanted to be a botanist. Calder looked at her, surprised. Really? I wanted to study how things grow, the patience of it, the way a seed becomes a tree without rushing, without forcing. She looked at the garden around them. I became a queen instead, which is the opposite of patience. You built this garden, Calder said, the messy one, the one that grows however it wants. Yes. Seems like the botanist won in the end. She smiled, And in that smile, he saw the young woman from the plague ward, the one who had looked at him with eyes that said, please, 30 years older, a lifetime heavier, but still there, still growing, still refusing to close her eyes. When it was time to leave, they stood, and Aelara did something she had not done since the plague ward. She reached up and touched his face, lightly, with fingertips that trembled. Whatever you choose, she said, do not disappear again. I'll try, he said. No promises about immortality, though. She laughed, soft, the laugh of a woman who had earned every sound of joy she would ever make. Lyrian walked him to the ship. She was quiet most of the way, which was unusual for her. She had spent days being the loudest person in every room, arguing, defending, demanding. The kind of daughter who fought for people by making their enemies wish they had chosen a different career. But now she was quiet. They reached the landing cradle. The ship was already prepped. Small, fast, human-compatible. The kind of vessel that could cross systems without drawing attention. Calder turned to face her and found that words were harder to find than expected, because this woman, this fierce, stubborn, brilliant woman who had found him by accident and refused to let him be lost again, had become something he hadn't had in 30 years, a friend. You know, she said, my mother spent years wondering who you might have become if you had lived. Disappointingly similar, Calder said. I'm afraid. She looked at him, and he saw it. The same thing he had seen in Aelara, in Voss, in every face that had looked at him since he arrived on this world. Not worship, not legend, just a man, complicated, flawed, carrying grief and humor and guilt and kindness in the same tired body, standing in a wrinkled jacket, with a scar on his chin, trying. She hugged him. Quick, fierce, the kind that says everything words can't. The kind that happens between people who haven't known each other long, but somehow know each other completely. Don't vanish on me, she said into his shoulder. I'll send postcards, he said. Interstellar ones, very slow. She pulled back, held him at arm's length, looked at his face the way her mother had, memorizing it, but differently. Not as someone clinging to a memory, as someone making a promise to remember a living person. You know, she said, when I followed that biosignal to your station, I expected to find a data error, a malfunction, maybe a piece of equipment that needed recalibrating. Instead, you got me, Calder said, which is arguably worse than a malfunction. Instead, I got a man who names his maintenance drones. He blinked. How did you? Gerald wobbled past me when I boarded. You had a label on him, in marker, Gerald, with a smiley face. Calder opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I was lonely. I know, she said softly. That's why it matters. Eyes bright, not crying, refusing to cry, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided that this is not a goodbye. This is a pause. The research program launches next cycle, she said. Name for Harlan. Mother will oversee the framework. Voss is contributing resources. Tell Voss I said thank you. Tell him yourself. The communication relay goes live next week. He smiled. I will. She stepped back, hands at her sides, chin up, posture perfect. The princess standing at the edge of a story that was no longer about a dead man, but about a living one. Calder walked up the ramp, stopped at the top, turned back one last time. The planet stretched behind Lyrian, vast, blue-green, a world that had mourned him before it ever truly knew him, a world that would go on, growing, changing, aging, while he remained. He raised a hand, not a wave exactly, more of an acknowledgement, a small gesture that said, I see you, I see all of it, and I will carry it with me. She raised hers in return. The ramp closed. The ship lifted, smooth, quiet, rising through atmosphere and cloud, and the thin, bright line where a planet's air becomes the rest of forever. He returned to human space quietly, as he always had, but this time without hiding. He took work on fringe colonies, teaching medicine to people who cared less about credentials and more about whether you showed up when things went wrong. Small clinics, overworked staff, patients who didn't ask where you came from, only whether you could help. I helped. The first colony was a mining settlement on the edge of map space. 32 families, one medical clinic. No doctor for 6 months before Calder arrived. The equipment was outdated, the supplies were thin. The administrator was a woman named Doss, who looked at his credentials, looked at his face and said, "I don't care how old you are or aren't. Can you set a broken arm?" He could set a broken arm. He set a lot of broken arms and treated infections and delivered 3 babies in his first year, including one at 4 a.m. during a power failure. By flashlight. While the father paced in the hallway and asked every 30 seconds if everything was okay. Everything was okay. Everything was messy and loud and terrifying and beautiful. That was the thing about medicine on the frontier. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't research. It wasn't compound analysis or cellular modification. It was holding someone's hand and saying, "I'm here. You're going to be fine," and meaning it enough that they believed you. He watched generations pass. Yes, he watched students become doctors, become retirees, become memories. He watched children he had treated grow up and bring their own children to him. He watched time do what time does, move forward, without him. There was a boy on the third colony, maybe 12, bright, curious, the kind of kid who asked questions faster than you could answer them. He wanted to be a doctor. Calder taught him how to read blood panels, how to listen to a heartbeat, how to notice the things a patient doesn't say. Years later, a message arrived. The boy had graduated from medical school, top of his class. He had named his thesis after a technique Calder had taught him, the one about adapting treatment to the patient instead of the protocol. Calder read the message 3 times. Then he sat in a chair for a very long time. Because that, right there, that was what Harlan had been talking about all those years ago in the plague ward, when he said, "There's losing and there's giving up, and we haven't done that second one yet." This was the not giving up part, the part that came after survival, the part that mattered. He let himself be known, if only briefly, if only in small circles. He told jokes that landed awkwardly. He burned meals he tried to cook. He stayed up too late reading medical journals and fell asleep at his desk with the lights on. He lived messily, imperfectly, the way living is supposed to be done. Sometimes at night, messages arrived through channels that bent space just enough to feel like small miracles. Updates from Lyrian, research milestones, new findings from the Harlan Mercer Institute, publications with his friend's name in the header, data that was being studied properly, carefully, the way Harlan would have wanted. Notes from Alara, shorter, more personal, the kind that don't say much but mean everything. A sentence about the garden, a comment about the weather, a reminder that she was still there, still ruling, still difficult to kill. And once, a message from Voss, brief, clinical, but with a postscript that said, "Talia would have approved of the program. I believe that matters." Calder believed it did too. He kept every message, stored them on a data chip he carried in his jacket pocket, the same pocket where he had once kept Harlan's photograph. Now both lived there, the past and the present, side by side, the way they should be. On quiet nights, when the colony was asleep and the stars were out, and the silence felt less like loneliness and more like peace, he would read them, one by one. Lyrian's sharp observations, Alara's quiet affections, Voss's careful formality hiding something warmer underneath. He wasn't alone anymore. Not really. Not the way he had been. The distance was real. The light years were real. But the connection was real too. And sometimes that was enough, more than enough. Years passed, decades. The galaxy turned, and one evening, standing on a small balcony of a very ordinary apartment, on a very ordinary colony, with a very ordinary cup of tea, Calder caught his reflection in the glass. He looked the same face, same scar, same eyes that Alar had described to her daughter, that Lyrian had recognized in a corridor on a forgotten station, that Harlan had looked into and said, "Let me do it," and been told no. He looked the same. And for once, for the first time in more years than he could count, it didn't bother him, because the face in the glass was no longer a stranger's, no longer a mistake. It was his. The face of a man who had survived a plague and lost a friend and hidden from a galaxy and been found by a princess and stood in a council chamber and told the truth. His face, with all of it showing. He raised the cup. Human tea, inferior to the alien kind, but familiar. And sometimes familiar is enough. I thought about Harlan, about the smile in the photograph that now hung in research labs across 4 systems, about the man who had deserved to live and didn't, and about how the grief had not gone away, would never go away, but had changed shape over time, from a wound into a compass, pointing him towards something Harlan had understood instinctively and Calder had needed 30 years to learn. That surviving is not the same as living, that hiding is not the same as being safe, that the bravest thing a person can do is not to sacrifice themselves, but to stay and be known and let the world see them, scars and failures and all. He took a sip, set the cup down, leaned against the railing. The stars were out, the same stars, unchanged, like him, but seen differently now, not as escape routes, not as hiding places, just as light, beautiful, distant, patient. And Calder smiled. Not the embarrassed smile that Alara had described to her daughter. Not the deflecting one he wore like armor. A different one, quieter, steadier. The smile of a man who had finally stopped running from time.